everyone. Today we are going to learn about sustainability from one of the true leaders of the field, Lightyear, the makers of the world's most efficient and sustainable electric vehicle, the Lightyear Zero. I would like to welcome Henk to share some experiences on this very important topic. So Henk, you are the VP of Sustainability at Lightyear, but as I understand you also have a lot of experience in other industries.
Yeah, indeed. I've been responsible globally for sustainability at Royal Philips for many years. So there's quite some extensive experience in the area of sustainability. And I've been driving the subject in that company, starting with manufacturing to product development, ultimately to make a strategic issue, including ERM systems and PLM to a certain extent, but I had a very big team working on that. So I'm more the strategy guy and not so much hands-on experience in that area, but still. And I retired at Philips, and then I said, okay, maybe it's good that I can use my experience to help a startup company to really become sustainable, because that's a little bit more than just CO2 reduction for sure. And that's why I picked up the phone. I said to Lightyear, hey, maybe I can help. So that's how it went. Yeah.
Before going into the details, what is your kind of personal take on this subject, given your long experience? How do you relate to this topic?
I'm a chemist from originally, and I've been in education also for quite a number of years. So from a chemical point of view, it's really interesting to see how the development was and where it all started many decades ago. The whole sustainability thinking, mainly starting from an environmental perspective, and later on the social dimension came on board. And my personal take was always that, certainly in the beginning, a lot of people were thinking that it will only be solved if you put in a lot of money and then the world will change, to put it simply. And I thought, if you take a look at it from a business perspective, maybe you can do things differently. And that stance I've always taken. And so that's my personal point of view. How can you use sustainability as a business driver?
So it's not something, you shouldn't see it as a cost. It's something that enables business.
It might cost money, but it also can bring you money, and it also can bring you sales and turnover, depending how smart you organize your activities. And by the way, that's a remark I have to make, that really depend on where you are with your activities in the value chain. If you're in the short cycling products like food or textile, the story will be a little different, but from I think strategic business perspective, particularly for the high-tech industry, I think it can be very interesting to use it as a business driver, which I've been pushing a lot within my previous company, and ultimately it became rather successful.
And do you see, what are the main differences between a company traditionally, I don't know if it's polite to say, but a traditional company like Philips or a startup like Lightyear in this respect? Do you see significant differences in the way of thinking or acting? Or?
There's the age differences. So if you look at management in general and so on and so forth, speed of decision making sometimes can be quicker, and people are more motivated to a certain extent because they're younger. But frankly speaking, that's a kind of side effect, because now I'm working within Lightyear as a startup company compared to Philips. It's a global multinational. Okay, things are more, the viscosity of the organization is slower, so to speak. But the amount of pushing power you need to convince people is to a certain extent the same, because the convincing factor is still very relevant, even with a young startup company.
And that also brings me to the next section here, that is more about the business drivers. That's interesting to hear. And my first question was really how important, more in general about the importance of sustainability. And seen from the outside, it would appear that's all this company is about. If you look at the website and so on, this is a company that is founded because the founders want to do something about sustainability in automotive. But you're saying that there is still an aspect of pushing going on to fully make it happen.
And the reason for that is that I mentioned my experience. It started all on environmental issues and from an environment. But if you look at what investors are framing around the subject of sustainability and what the outside world is framing around sustainability, it's much broader than just the environmental aspect. It's particularly the social aspects. It's particularly also the business ethics aspects. It's particularly how are you scrutinizing or analyzing your supply chain in that area, which is broader, and that's how I already said when I introduced, than just doing simple CO2 reduction. Simple between quotation marks, of course. So the problem is if you profile yourself as a company from a sustainability perspective, there's much more to it, and that much more part, particularly the social and the governance part, is more in the area of risk and reputation management to a good extent. And also, that's not always very sexy, and also sometimes a very cumbersome exercise.
So greenwashing is not good enough for you?
No, certainly not. And that's why I picked up the phone after my experience and said, because Lightyear, of course, there were 5 founders that said, okay, we want to improve the world and we want to build a very sustainable car and so on and so forth. And I thought, good, but be aware that there's more to it. And that's the kind of experience I try to bring in. So if you buy a new aircraft, the engines are just in a business model that is guaranteed forever that it will work. And you pay an X amount, either in a lease or a rent or whatever model. And that approach is also interesting, I think, and maybe different for the car industry to a certain extent. And my background within Philips was the same. Let me give you a little bit a historic background on that part. Philips was in the business of refurbishment for roughly 5% of its turnover. And now I'm talking about a decade ago. And we did an inventory, what happened to the other 95%. And that other 95% of all the equipment was reused. And I'm talking, by the way, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not talking about coffee makers. I'm not talking about shavers. I'm not talking about radio equipment, TV or whatever. I'm talking about what Philips calls the big irons, meaning ultrasound, MRI machines, and CT scanners. So that type of high-tech equipment. And we learned with the study that that equipment was reused in several phases. And they last at least 10, 15, 20 years or even longer. And a lot of other people, mainly other companies or brokers, were making a lot of money on that. And that was a big signal to start looking at the total portfolio of not only brand new products, but also first line, second line, third line, after 3, 5, 10 years, and see what you can put in the market, still branded as the original OEM. And how much money you could make and how your customer base would change and so on and so forth. Now, that type of experience I brought along also within Lightyear, trying to do the same. Because currently, if you look at the OEMs in the automotive industry in general, their business model is the following. They make a new car, they sell it, they got a profit margin, and they make parts for the car for the dealer organization, and they sell those parts, and that's their business model. Now, that's nice for ICE cars, but for cars that have a much longer lifetime because the number of components is completely different and so on and so forth, I think the world will change also in that area. So I'm very much promoting within Lightyear to see whether or not Lightyear, not only in the business model development, can put brand new cars on the market, but also make those cars reusable, refashionable, whatever, in order to see how you can serve the market after a car comes back after 3 to 5 years, even after 10 years or 15 years. And for that, also related to PLM system, for instance, in the design phase, the design of the car in terms of material, in terms of part, in terms of disassemblability time, in terms of assembly time, and all kind of aspects in terms also of data that you need to know, because it's almost like doctor-patient relation, that you want to know how the patient in good words, in good terms, is doing for the rest of his life. You need to gather data to a great extent to see how it goes in order to more or less help and develop your business model. That's the kind of approach that I'm trying to introduce within Lightyear. And that's based on quite expensive experience within Philips and pretty successful from a strategic point of view. Most development processes are linear, meaning that you have an idea, you put things together, and then ultimately you think that it lasts for a certain amount of time, and that's about it. And if you start thinking in a circular way, it simply means that you need to do some redesigning, but it's not really rocket science what you need to do differently. Give you a simple example. If a first prototype of a technological product is made, then of course, you have relatively high development cost, and then usually processes start designed for cost out. And that means that you need to try to reduce the bill of labor, you try to reduce the bill of materials, and so on and so forth. If you do not take into account in that thinking that a product needs to be repairable, reusable, or materials or whatever, you make different decisions. And those different decisions can be overcome by start thinking from day one onwards. I can guarantee you, if you go to an arbitrary OEM, usually people have a long list of assembly time of the different parts, but if you ask them whether or not they can provide you with a list of disassembly times, most people don't do that. And then that means that the principles in the design will only change because you need to rethink whether or not you made the correct decision on, hey, I did welding, shouldn't it be screwing or clicking? Or how about the choices I've made on using gluing? And so it's really not rocket science, because in most of those processes, those thinking steps never are being made. People go automatically to the cheapest and to the quickest solution to put things together, because that reduces the total cost.
So in some cases, it will affect the cost, that you choose something that is better in the long run, but may be more expensive in the initial manufacturing.
Indeed,
and
then you get the situation of the total cost of ownership, because then the question is, where are obviously those costs made? Are they initially made? And therefore, keeping control of the car over its lifetime is relevant in order to also to control the cost on one end. But if you decide to make a bigger investment in upfront, then you need to have control over the life cycle of the car to see at what moment you can get those current costs back. Financially speaking, by the way, I understand and I know that there are some cases that it's an arbitrary decision. Maybe you decide upfront not to make those costs, but that means that later on you will be confronted with other costs.
How do you see that from a customer perspective? And you're mentioning that it sounds like the business model that you are hinting towards is something that you don't yet have in place. That's something you might have in the future. Is that correct? The idea is still the current business model is still to sell the car, or are you already looking into other ways of?
Yes, we are, because in a one-on-one linear transaction, that's a given. But there are quite a number of contacts already with lease companies. And so on and so forth. You can even go one step further by see whether or not you can find a financial provider and do your own leasing to a certain extent. But what's very relevant, particularly also for electric vehicles, is that autonomous driving is somewhere around the corner. And strategically, if autonomous driving will become more evident and more practical to a certain extent, the whole business model world and the whole world completely change.
It becomes service.
It becomes service. Yeah. And that service type of thing is very interesting for a company to make a car that lasts very long, to control the car as much as possible. Whether or not you're the owner of the car as an original company, or there's a financing company who is the ownership, that's in fact only a secondary question. But in that type of thinking, I think it's very relevant to see how you originally designed a car. And by the way, if you look at Tesla, And their way of thinking, they've already taken that to a certain extent into account. For instance, in the United States, if you have used a Tesla leased, given in a lease contract from Tesla itself, and the lease period is over, you cannot purchase the car anymore. You cannot say, okay, for the rest amount of value, I want to purchase a car. No, Tesla wants that car back, and they put it in a fleet, and they put it on stock in order to develop their own autonomous fleet. So that's really, whether or not it will happen, and that's a different story. But coming back to your original question, Johannes, from a business development point of view, this is really interesting. And there's also a lot of work to be done, because in most development situations that I know of, that type of thinking usually does not happen.
I think you're right. And I think we see big differences between the industries that we operate in. So some companies we work with, they have products that are designed to last 40, 50 years. And they also tend to have a huge responsibility for the aftermarket and serviceability. So they as a OEM are already accountable, while that is typically not the case in automotive, like you're touching on. They're more sell the car, get the money, build the next one.
That's true, but there's something very important that you mentioned, also related to the business model. I think the servicing part will become more and more important in general than the making of the car, for a number of reasons, be it the autonomous driving story or being because it's a better money maker. Again, if you take the parallel of Tesla, they do a linear sale to the customer, and they do their servicing themselves. I just last week read an article that the service part is becoming more and more interesting from a cash cow principle within Tesla. And interestingly, just to mention another interesting brand, Lexus. Lexus, you might recall that when Lexus was introduced, I think 50 years ago, they introduced the car, including the red carpet methodology, meaning you're the customer, you're treated like you're king, the red carpet is there, they pick up the car, bring it at home, all that kind of stuff. Now, Lexus is very late, and by the way, Toyota as well, in the whole EV situation. But Lexus just half a year ago, they put down a statement and said, we believe that all EV manufacturers to put a car on the market with a guarantee period of 10 years. And so that's really interesting why they put it and in such a way. And if you read the small letters, they say, that's relevant for a Lexus in due course, but it needs to be serviced always with the same service organization from Lexus and so on and so forth. So in that way, they try to get a grip of the service situation. And I think for Lightyear, the whole servicing part is also very interesting, so to speak. So making a car that's almost fashionable, particularly from an interior point of view, I think it's great. Give you an example from my own. I'm driving a Tesla Model S. The chairs of my car, and because my car is already 9 years old, not that good as the current ones. I cannot change the chairs simply because the rails are different and it simply doesn't fit. So that's the design principle. Another element also to mention and put it in a timeline from an EV perspective is the following. When I was still working at Philips and I wanted to give an example, so I said, I want to drive a Tesla, and that should be part of the total lease package for all the cars that were offered. At that time, that was hardly possible because the lease company that Philips was working with, they were very frightened about the depreciation and about the battery. Now, my car has 220,000 kilometers on the odometer, and the battery degradation is 6%. So that's peanuts. That's peanuts. Meaning the following. That battery can last for another 220. Then maybe you're at a level of 10-12% degradation. And even then, that battery can be used in stationary situations for storage of energy for another decade. So we're talking about one of the most important parts of an electric vehicle that will at least have a lifetime of 2 decades or even more. So just an important example. Also from the interior point of view in the development of a car, you can start thinking about, like I just mentioned with the chairs, maybe at some time. So
what I think strategically will change is the following. Most car companies, as OEMs, they were changing the car after 3 or 4 years with kind of facelift. Something different headlights, that kind of stuff. And that's about it. In principle, the car really didn't change. I think that electric vehicles will change differently. They will be more timeless, so to speak, from a model point of view. And because they will last longer, and there will be much repairability, repair stuff, and so on and so forth. So if you know that up front and you take that into account from day one onwards in the designing of your cars and the way you develop your business models and your service organization and so on and so forth, I think it can be very beneficial. And that's the influence that I try to have within Lightyear based on my experience from Philips and others.
Yeah. So great insight. And I think that your example with the Tesla also proves it to some extent, since the Model S is already 10 years on the market and it still looks more or less the same. Even if you cannot replace the seats, it's still the same basic design, but then heavily upgraded.
And my engine was changed once because it was a malfunctioning, because it was one of the early ones. Yeah. But if you tell people how low the current costs are for charging, and in my case it's zero, because I'm an early adapter from Tesla, I can supercharge for free. But I only have wipers, I got tires, and that's about it. And even the brake pads of my current car are at 80%. Because you usually brake to a great extent on the engine, using the engine. And so from start, they never change. Oh. No, in the Netherlands, we got this organization to have a yearly, every 3 years, a control of the car if it's more than 4 years old. And every year I need to go there, and the guy is always very dissatisfied because I go in the car there. After half an hour, I pick up the phone and say, I can't make any money from you because there's nothing there. And that way of thinking, I think, is relevant. And even within Lightyear, at least there are quite a number of people that are coming from the traditional OEMs. And in my convincing people within the organization, I learned that it's a little bit between the ears to a certain extent that needs to change that type of thinking.
And I think that what we see, so I'm based in Norway, as I said, and we
are a great example.
Are currently at some 85% of all new cars are EVs. And I think that apart from a very favorable taxation, or that you avoid tax on electric cars, which has been really fueling this transition, I think that it's also quite obvious that people start to think a lot more about the lifetime cost of when choosing a car, of service, of the electricity consumption, and so on. While in the past, that was only marginal differences. You wouldn't really consider this car over that car just because Ford had a cheaper service program than Mercedes, for instance. It would be totally different factors that most people would more look at the price tag and the quality of the car as it is. So I think this is the mindset is changing when you move to electric.
Depreciation of electric vehicles is much less than from combustion car, and even will become it. My car currently, I looked at it, and I think my car was new, I think 100,000 euros. I can still sell it for 38,000 euros.
After 9 years.
Yeah, after 9 years. So there's a big depreciation, but not that big if you compare it to another type, another brand or another combustion car. And I think that will change over time. The depreciation will decrease even further. But in my point of view, that will be related to whether or not there will be introduction of autonomous driving, and then the car fleet will completely change. Because if autonomous driving really is surfacing to a great extent, you get a completely different world. Currently, around 65 million passenger cars per year are sold, 65 million globally. And the total amount, the sales increase globally is about 3 to 4%. But you will see if cars will last longer, and if autonomous driving will become a habit, then the total volume of sales will go down. That's one thing. And I think the intrinsic value of a car will increase, and thereby the depreciation will reduce. That's my point of view strategically over time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you see this from the customer perspective, what do you know about your customers' preferences in these aspects? How are they valuing these, I would say, qualities of your product?
True. There's not a unique customer. I think the customer needs to be viewed from a segmentation point of view in terms of age. People from my age, and they're used to having it. If you don't little amount of money, and the moment you start working, the first thing you need to have is a car, because car is part of your image, whatever. You need to go from A to B and so on and so forth. But the car stands idle for 80 to 85%. And it's a very big investment. Currently, if you look at millennials and other type of people, they're much more interested in going from A to B and in a certain amount of time and spending that time differently. So I think that the view on the car will change related to becoming more mature of the certain age category of the 20s and the people in the 30s. That's one thing. And that will be fueled by autonomous driving.
Yeah. Yeah.
So interesting. Let me give you an example. 5 years ago, on one of the Dutch islands, Terschelling, there was an experiment called What Car with Nissan Leafs. And interestingly, because it was an island, it was geo-fenced, so you couldn't easily lose the cars. And there were around 50 Nissan Leafs, and it's like with the scooters here already in Helmond and in Eindhoven. So you got an app, you go there, you click on the app, you see whether there's damage on the car, you can use the car, you go do shopping, stop the agreement, you do the shopping, you come back, you had a blue car, and 100 meters further down the road there's a red car, and then you pick that up. That experience was great, and I think that will probably also ultimately come with cars. At least in the Netherlands, if you see how this is going with scooters and with electric bikes, it's amazing how rapidly that's going.
We had just the other day, it was an announcement that one of the early movers in Norway on that topic, they had to close down their business. So they were not able to make the business sustainable. But they did that with Renault Zoe, where they placed them around the town, and you could just unlock it with an app, exactly like the scooters. But I think there was probably some issues with their business model. But I think there are some attempts already. But I think I haven't seen the really successful ones yet. But I also believe that we will move in that direction. But again, a little bit back to the customer perspective again, because obviously at the moment you only have one car model, and the big car makers, they have all sorts of different models to meet different customer groups and preferences. But how do you see, who do you expect to be the early adopters of your car? Do you have a specific target group in mind?
For the current car, of course, that's been put in the market at Lightyear, that those are all wealthy people that are trying to invest in something that they want to have as a kind of a gadget or whatever, or a kind of angel investors. The second model, the Lightyear 2, is a different story, because that's segmented currently in the area of 35,000 euros. And probably, if you differentiate, there will be early adopters to a certain extent, but also from a sustainability perspective, there will be people that will buy the car because it's a very sustainable car, because it's at a very low energy consumption. It has a solar roof on top. And including what I just said, also in the design phase, we want to profile the car from a sustainability perspective with regard to the materials that have been used. The choice of the materials from a CO2 perspective, the footprint of the making, and also on the reuse possibilities. The persuasion factor will be that the cost of driving this car is relatively low because of the energy consumption.
Yeah, that's also the learnings from Norway. I think that since we had extremely high taxes on conventional cars, then you had the possibility to lower or remove that to make a very strong financial incentive to buy go electric. So I think it's probably a mix of motivations for doing it. But I think you shouldn't. I agree that you shouldn't underestimate the financial aspects. That they still care about their wallet, or at least most people.
But you already made a valid remark that most people that after they've convinced to start driving electric, they start thinking in terms of total cost of ownership. Thinking they look at the cost of, and the first driver will be the cost down of your operational costs because the electricity costs are much lower, and then the maintenance will be the next one, and that usually does the trick. Next, of course, to the driving experience, which is okay, something different. So far, I've at least so many people have driven my car because you can talk forever. I just say, hey, here are the keys, just go for a drive and then we'll talk later.
But that's also an aspect that makes people open their wallet. So that as a bonus, you get a super fast car as well. Anyway, I agree it might not be needed. If you think about the ownership, not just formal, but maybe more in practice around this topic in the company. How do you see that? Is it something that is on your table only, or what kind of? How do you see the buy-in and ownership from other members of management or from?
First of all, the original founders are certainly behind this whole thinking. That's one thing. Secondly, we're a startup company, and as a startup company, we're continuously looking for investors. In the beginning phase, you have angel investors, which are individuals, but now we're going, or already been shifting into areas where we want to have other type of investors on board. And interestingly, because of the profile of you get investors on board that are extremely keen on the E, the S, and the G profiling of the company and what we're doing. So that's also helping to push things forward in a company. To give you,
do you see any change or development over time with respect to that topic?
Within the total portfolio of investors, you still got the specific ESG funds, which are now being attracted by Lightyear. But based on the experience that I bring along from my previous company, where we've been talking with those type of investors, and at the same time also with the big institutional investors, also big institutional investors have already been changing in that area to a certain extent, and that will also, I think that will keep on going in general for sure. So I think ultimately there will be big institutional investors that will be interested in Lightyear and their products, but they will put down the same constraints with regard to their investment decisions that the small investment funds are doing now. And for instance, all the math and calculations I've been doing with extrapolation scenarios of 10 to 15 years, if you sell X amount of cars, the total CO2 contribution, the total contribution to recycled content, all those type of questions come along, and we need to do a model calculation in order to convince those investors.
And that's something you're already doing?
Yes, I'm doing it quite extensively.
And also those are public figures that you put in your reports and disclose to investors?
We disclose things to investors, but in the public area, and that's also related to maybe to we currently have an annual report where we have just a small number of elements that we profile from a sustainability perspective. But in the making in more than in the making, but let's put it in the making, there's already a complete program. And one of the questions that was in your listing with regard to sustainability program on the environmental aspects with regard to target setting. One of the targets, obviously, as company practice what you preach. So we are a carbon neutral company, but being a carbon neutral company, you can easily say that because everything that's not carbon neutral, you compensate, and then you're carbon neutral. That's an easy way out. But the problem lies in the fact that the carbon footprint itself should also be reduced. And the carbon footprint of the company has quite a number of parameters, like the operations, like the car itself, and so on and so forth. And for that, we're also putting down reduction targets to see what we can do. We're still in the development phase for that one, as key performance indicators, just to mention a very important example. Our carbon footprint profile was relatively simple. You can find it in our annual report of last year. But based on that, we now have a better insight in the carbon footprint of the materials of the car, the use of the car, the end of life situation of the car, the operations, and what our partner Valmet is doing in that area. And there now we're looking what the possibilities are to really reduce the footprint. And by the way, also related to maybe to PLM systems, I don't know whether you're in that area as well. Logistics will become a very important part in reducing footprint, because if you make choices to make things, you make usually geographic choices. You choose a supplier, but if the supplier is far away, you automatically get an X amount of CO2 related to it because of the shipment. The transport mode is relevant. That's becoming increasingly important. So also in the decision, so going back to the original discussion that we just had about the decision, in the decision of choosing a supplier, those elements need to be taken into account, because otherwise it will bite you in the tail. It's at some moment in time.
So a very, very valid point. And you also started by saying that, of course, sustainability is about a lot more than carbon footprint. Do you have other examples on what you are actually measuring and following up on, and have specific targets on?
Yeah, we started measuring simple things in the production area and in this building. It's water usage, waste, and then the waste split up in categories like hazardous and non-hazardous waste, whether or not it's, and then you need to negotiate with your contractor and see whether or not the waste is being recycled or not, whether or not it's incinerated. Simply just digging up those data is relevant, because then A, you know how much, B, whether or not you can set targets, and C, you can report about it. As an example, emissions is another factor, not so relevant for us. But if you got a lacquering business or whatever, like a car company, then emissions are important. Just to mention a few other elements in the environmental area. And I already mentioned, we set ourselves a target of non-virgin materials. In X amount of the total bill of materials should be non-virgin. We're currently debating whether or not it will be 25 or 30%. And then we need to try to find the metrics to calculate that and to see how we're doing. That's also related to the PLM systems, by the way, because me personally, in any type of decision an engineer is making, he or she should know at least the composition of the material or the composition of the part and the related CO2 footprint to that, and also the recycled content and so on and so forth, next to factors like cost and weight and that kind of stuff, which should be registered for sure.
And these are decisions that usually has to be made quite early in the design.
Yeah, indeed.
And how do you see other links to PLM or to IT tools in general? In what way can modern
one of the things, but
IT solutions have?
I do not know how TECHNIA is doing the ERM business, but if you look at ESG, I'm just mentioning a set of environmental parameters. There's a whole set of social parameters, and there's a set of governance parameters. Usually with startup companies or small companies, they start with either a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet or whatever. I'm very much promoting to make that part of an overall ERM system in order to make cross correlations between different parameters. What I learned from a previous company, that of course, you're in this business, so probably this wouldn't sound very strange to you. But if I will be a CEO or part of a board of management of the company, I love to have a cockpit with 5 screens. And on those 5 screens, we got the financial parameters, we got the environmental parameters, we got the social parameters, and so on and so forth. Preferably real time, but okay, that's not always the case. And there will be interlinks to see, hey, sometimes you see a financial parameter changing and there can be a correlation with other parameters. Within my previous company, we did quite an extensive exercise on the overall travel activities of the total organization. It started from a CO2 footprint perspective, but we coupled that to the financial aspects, and by the way, also for energy and so on and so forth. And then you suddenly see that reducing the environmental footprint and financial costs go hand in hand. So, for instance, there was a meeting in Shanghai, and there were also video conferencing facilities, but still a lot of people were flying. Video conferences were underutilized. And then, of course, a policy was made to see how you can change it.
Absolutely. So it's all about visibility and measurability, that you can prove it to the people who make the decisions.
But also,
show the value.
And convince them, for sure. So in that point of view, PLM systems, ERM systems are extremely valuable in my perspective. Of course, rubbish in is rubbish out. So, the input parameter and how you do that is very important. But I think in most cases, the decision to go for those systems are usually made relatively late or too late in the process. And then you need to do a lot of backward engineering to get things right.
Do you have more specifically related to IT tools? Do you have any initiatives to look at potential improvements, new capabilities, new systems that can support some of these things?
No, not yet. From an ESG reporting perspective, at least we made an agreement that I should take a look at what's on the market. There are many different tools on the market, but that decision still needs to be made. So we're currently in the phase of just having some Excel spreadsheets and so on and so forth for the few simple parameters that we track down. But I'm very much against that. I would love to have it part of the overall system from day one onwards. And by the way, but that's more out of your scope probably, but I'm very much in favor of integrated reporting externally, financial, non-financial aspects, and also have external accountancy from day one onwards on also the non-financial parameters. So not only on the financial, but also on the non-financial parameters. So if you probably know the internal control mechanisms for at least a stock listed company. You got to put it simply, you got a bookkeeper who writes down sales X and that kind of. Then you got an internal controller who's controlling the bookkeeper. Then you got the accountant who's controlling the control and the bookkeeper. That's the mechanism that you need not only for the financials, but for any other type of parameter that is relevant within the company from an external reported perspective. Meaning that also you provide, for instance, to your external accountants, you provide access to the same systems as the company has. You probably are already familiar with that to a certain extent, I presume.
Absolutely. And how do you see, part of this is about measuring and reporting. How do you see that versus more decision support? We talked a bit about making sure that the engineers make the right choices, choose the right supplier, select materials with parts with the right composition of materials, and so on.
Also on the decision side, I think one of the tools that we've developed, you might have heard of it, is scoring formula. Okay. Scoring formula is a formula where we take all different kinds of CO2 parameters and they are weighted, and there's an ultimate outcome in CO2 terms, ultimately meant to guide the overall process of decision making in this area.
And this is taking the full picture into account. So it's not only about the product; it's also about processes, actual usage, and it's really the full life cycle.
Yeah, it is. It is. It is. It's in fact. It's a sales parameter, it's a volume parameter, how much, but it's also the CO2 footprint of the car, and that footprint is broken down into making, using, and disposing. And those factors are putting into one, formula in order to facilitate the decision making on areas in the company.
We have been through many topics now, but if you try to summarize a bit, what are the main benefits coming from, addressing sustainability in the right way, as you have explained? What are the main benefits for the company?
Main benefits will be that in the total segmentation of customers, you will attract two categories that are relevant. One is the people that are more interested in the green part, but the second one will be they're interested in the cost savings because the car is so extremely efficient. So for the one category, you translate the car into terms of CO2 contribution. For the other category, you simply translate it into money. So that's, I think, in important driver, I would say. We also talked about circular business. Usually a OEM is only interested in developing the brand new market. I think there are really big opportunities in the market of cars that are 4 or 5 years old and even 10 to 12 years old. Because if you do the math, and of course I'm not only talking, this is not only based on my conviction, of course we did already some calculations in extrapolation over the 10 to 12 years. You can really have an interesting profit and increase your turnover by simply start to accommodating that market. And then related to that, from a revenue model, that also helps you to have a better revenue model in the service activities that you're doing in the organization.
Do you have any metric or indication on where you or a typical OEM are today? Revenue from new sales versus revenue from aftermarket refurbishment? Do you have any finger in the air?
That's almost a chicken and egg situation, frankly speaking, because there are many data on second and third and fourth hand car markets, but they're all from combustion engine market cars. And the problem that we have is to do that extrapolation. The only good example that was in a volume is Tesla. And Tesla is pretty proprietary on those data, so there's something there, but that's about it. So it's if people ask me, what is an EV? I say, okay, if you really bring the EV down, it's a skateboard with a little house, and both the skateboard and the house, they're made of a certain amount of material, they last very long. Okay, then you got the battery, given. You got the interior, given. You got a very sophisticated IT system to run the car and to be continuously updated. Those are all, to a certain extent, they can, if you do it smart, they can last very long. So to put it in simple words, the big computer in the car can be a nuisance. If you look at that, what Tesla is happening, it happens. They need to redo the car because they have a lot of things, particularly full self-driving, that's asking a lot more computing power. But, so the only thing that's left is the drivetrain from the car with the engines and the suspension and so on and so forth. That's more related to steering wheel. So that's a simple and given from an electric vehicle. And that perspective, I think, is very relevant to use to start thinking about how long a car will last and how much you can do with the other markets I just mentioned next to only selling brand new ones.
So if you take a look in your crystal ball that I'm sure you have in the office, what are the kind of most important things that you see ahead from a Lightyear perspective? What do you need to do in the next 5 years to?
Of course, we need to put the next car on the market. And that needs to be extremely successful. And by the way, we just mainly talked about the technical aspects, the design of the car, and the cargo volume, how much passengers, how many doors, all type of elements that are relevant to persuade, of course, a customer. But we're very much focusing on that one for the time being as a success factor to see whether or not we can make that a successful, because first car is just proof of concept. The second car will be make or break for sure.
But which you mentioned a lot of different aspects and also some things that you think you need to do, like changing business model and other things. Do you see these being realized as part of bringing the next car to the market, or is it further into the future?
No, I think particularly for the Lightyear 2, we're currently looking at different type of business models, including, for instance, total cost of ownership models, pay per minute, pay per kilometer, that type of thinking. Absolutely.
So it's happening now in the near future. This is not 5 years down the line.
In my point of view, and not only in my point of view, the development of EVs, if you just put the clock back maybe 5 to 10 years, people were not convinced that EV development would go that fast. Now it's going very fast. I think autonomous driving and total cost of ownership models and so on will also go in the same pace. So if you don't start thinking and incorporate it in your thinking now as a new startup company, you're dead and gone. By the way, just see what happens with the traditional OEMs, because we as a newcomer and also Tesla, we're just cannibalizing their market. They're cannibalizing their own market. For every ICE car that's not being sold, and EV cars, that's a completely different story. And I think that's. I'm really curious how many brands will survive.
Yeah, it's exciting times to be in the car industry. And one maybe fun fact: if you look at the top 10 or even top 20 list of best-selling cars in Norway, and for Europe as a whole, I think it's only one model that is on both lists. So 19 out of 20 are different in Norway because of the transformation. And among those are quite a lot of brands that no one has heard about 2 years ago. Chinese cars, not yet Lightyear, but hopefully soon. But clearly the shift is happening.
China brands are doing great, by the way. And of course, the big factor will be the battery capacity and how much battery capacity you can provide, because that will be the changing factor. And also, I think Teslas were relatively high priced, but they got a huge gross margin. So the moment they are in a better position from a manufacturing point of view, which is already happening in Shanghai, if you look at the total amount and look what's happening in Berlin, and also, I'm absolutely sure they will reduce the price and thereby try to increase their market shares. Okay, that's a different perspective, but that's, I think, what's going to happen.
Exactly. So now we have stolen almost an hour and a half of your precious time. So we are super happy that you could take the time to have this chat with us. I think we have learned a lot. I think it would still be interesting to maybe understand even better the link to engineering and to the tools that we are providing. But then we maybe need to bring some of your colleagues into the discussion.
The corporate was the one who asked me to participate in this interview, and I always keep in the back of my mind in all the conversations that I have, if there's something that need to be registered or need to change, or both at the engineering level or at the decision-making level, how can we accommodate that with IT? That's one of the factors I've been pushing all along, because it's difficult. So I will keep on doing that. And if you want to know more about the scoring formula I just mentioned, and particularly the IT aspects, you can get in contact with Casper. Yeah, sure.
That'd be super interesting, of course. But I think we'll wrap it up there. And again, big thank you for spending time with us.